England edged past Serbia in their opening game of the Euros, but their performance left a lot to be desired, and their attacking system failed to cause a lot of issues to Serbia's defence. And a big reason why was because of these very passive structures in possession. Let's take a look. So far this Euros, the big teams have not missed a step, and we've seen some very impressive performances from nations such as Germany and Spain. And last night was England's chance to prove that they can go all the way in this competition. But their performance didn't inspire much confidence in all the England fans. And we're going to be looking at why that might be the case, starting with the initial formations from both teams. So England started the match in a 4-2-3-1, while Serbia were in a 3-4-2-1. However, Serbia's defensive structure was much more with a back five, and then they did switch it in the second half. That meant they were a lot more aggressive and a lot more dangerous to England's defense. But we're going to be looking at what changes they made to exploit a weakness in England's structure. So the first thing I want to highlight is the build-up structure, and I want to highlight the position of Trent Alexander-Arnold as the double pivot alongside Declan Rice. Now, this is something that we know he does at Liverpool. We know he inverts into the centre, but the big difference is that when he's at Liverpool, he doesn't invert into the centre in this initial position here, but he does it much further up on the pitch when he's in this position here, when Liverpool already have control of the pitch and in the opposition's half. During build-up, Trent Alexander-Arnold is used in this position here where Walker is, and it's only when Liverpool move into the opposition's half and they have more control that he's more central in these positions here, because it's here where he has time to play these really dangerous diagonal balls across the pitch or balls in behind for the strikers or wingers to run onto. But in this position here, Alexander-Arnold isn't the most press-resistant player, and a lot of times he did make a few mistakes in possession that Serbia were able to take advantage of and maybe get a shot away from the edge of the box. But the main issue from England's build-up and why it never really worked during the match was because they had a lot of players coming towards the ball that wanted the ball to feet from Pickford. But by doing that, you completely isolated Kane and the front three, and Foden even was another player that would drop deep constantly alongside Bellingham. So England ended up with so many players in this position, but with Pickford playing long balls into Kane, the only player that could really provide support was Saka, and there was no way for England to outnumber Serbia's defense from these positions. So as these players even pushed up and tried to help out, there just wasn't enough time for England to really create a structured attack from this position. Now, like we said, the vast majority of the match wasn't played in this position, and England were able to get a little bit more control of the match and play in a slightly more advanced position. But it's exactly in this situation where England were toothless, and there was no real threat coming from England during the match. So the vast majority of the match looked something like this, with Trippier holding the width on the left, Saka holding the width on the right, and England building with a 3-1-3-2 structure depending on the position of Alexander-Arnold. And it's here we run into the first major issue. If we look at all these England players, such as Foden, Bellingham and Harry Kane, Alexander-Arnold, they're all players that want the ball to feet. None of these players are players that are comfortable always making runs in behind. So if it's Foden or Bellingham, they were constantly coming deep into these positions here to try and get the ball from the defenders. But this created absolutely no issues for Serbia's defense, because you'd end up with so many England players in this position and no one was threatening a run in behind. So Serbia really didn't have to do anything in the first half to stop all this possession that England had. They would end up with so many players in front of Serbia's midfield that it completely isolated the front three. And from these positions where England was then maybe able to work the ball out to Saka, when he did receive the ball, there was just no way that he could get past by himself. And it just took England way too long to give support to a player in this position. At times when they were able to get Walker in a more advanced position, they were quite dangerous, and we'll see why the goal resulted in this situation here. But essentially having all these players want the ball to feet meant that it completely isolated Serbia's defense and there was no threat for a ball in behind. Even when we look at a player like Harry Kane, he's not really the striker that's going to constantly make these runs in behind. As we all know, Harry Kane's favourite position is to drop deep between the lines, pick up the ball and then distribute it into either winger, in this case Trippier or Saka. But because the ball was never really being played into him in this position, and because there was no space for him to drop deep in between the lines, because you already had Bellingham and Foden and Alexander-Arnold already compacting this area in the centre of the pitch, Kane was essentially nullified for the whole match. I don't think he had a great game in the sense that he wasn't able to put down the long balls from Pickford, but at the same time, I don't think England played to Kane's strengths. So when you look at this formation on paper, it is relatively reminiscent of where these players play for their respective clubs. For example, Foden is used a lot in this half space on the left for Man City. Bellingham likes to drop deep and then attack in behind. But the major difference and why it didn't work for England is because when these players do this for their respective clubs, you have other players that pick up their position. For example, if Foden drops deep, maybe Trippier moves inside, maybe the striker's over here, maybe even the centre-back fullback pushes up, you have so many rotations around the player that means that there's always a threat on the defensive line and there's always the threat of a ball in behind. But with Trippier always hugging the touchline, never really moving into the half space except on a few occasions, Foden's movement deep meant that the defenders didn't have to do anything. There was no threat to them, and as he dropped deep, even the midfielders, they were like, okay, you can have the ball in this position, there's nothing for us to do, this isn't a threat to us. And the same with Bellingham. When Bellingham drops deep for Real Madrid, you have Vinny Jr. and you have Rodrigo making runs in behind. You have so many players that are attacking the space in behind. But with Bellingham, Foden and Harry Kane, all these players wanting the ball between the lines and deep, it meant there was absolutely no threat for England to score from these positions here, attacking between the lines. Now, England did start the game quite well in the sense that they did have possession and they were circulating possession quite well. And their goal did come very early in the match. And if we look at the goal, I think this is the only way England were ever going to score in this match. And if they carry on with this way of playing, this is the only way they will score in the competition because there was no central threat. All the threat had to come from out wide. And a big reason why I think they were able to score was because Walker was able to pick up a more advanced position. So you're starting to put their defense into a slightly more tricky position as someone has to make a choice on which player to cover. Now, once the ball was played in behind for Saka and he crossed it into the box, okay, the cross did take a deflection, but it's here where you realize how England can be dangerous. And because England have no players constantly making runs in behind and attacking the box centrally, you end up with a lot of runners on the edge of the box that can be dangerous from cutbacks and crosses from this position here, because they are behind the midfield line in situations, but when they attack the box, they're not already in position. So from these positions here, I think England can be dangerous. And we did see that with the goal with Bellingham reaching the ball before the defender, catching him off guard and attacking on the shoulders of the last defender by moving into this position here. However, if this is the only way England are going to create their chances, I think teams later on in the competition will very quickly figure out how to stop this. So my personal opinion is that they need more threats down the middle. And if you play with Bellingham, Foden and Harry Kane, these are three players that for their respective clubs are very well, but the respective clubs are built around their movement. If you have no players that are attacking in behind consistently, then it's going to be very difficult for England to create threats in other ways. So England were on top in the first half, at least in terms of possession and control of the game. But the second half was a completely different story, and Serbia were a lot more dangerous going forward. And a big reason because of that was how they used their wing-backs, so a big change in how they wanted to attack going forward. So in the first half, with Zivkovic and Kostic acting as the wing-backs, they were a lot more passive in possession. They were much more concerned about England's attacks, so these players were not able to push forward too much because they were scared of these overloads out wide with Saka and Trippier. But they realized very quickly that England weren't overloading the defense. There was no threat and they could easily outnumber these positions here. Now, the first major difference for Serbia was the introduction of Mladenovic in place of Kostic as the left wing-back position. From this position here, they weren't so concerned about keeping a back five anymore, unless England were controlling the ball in their half, but they were a lot more comfortable pushing forward. And in the second half, we saw their wing-backs stretching the pitch as much as possible and being very, very dangerous in these positions here, because then they were able to create these combinations between Milinkovic-Savic on the left-hand flank or Vlahovic on the right-hand flank. And then later on in the game with the introduction of Tadic for Mitrovic, they were a lot more dynamic in this position of the pitch here between the lines. And it was a lot harder for England to get control of the match, because again, as England regained possession and tried to play it forward into the striker, all we had was support from Saka because there was no support from Foden and Bellingham, who had to drop deep to stop Serbia overloading the space between the lines. So in these positions here, Serbia were a lot more dangerous. We saw the back three picking up a much wider position, meaning Saka and Kane were left in two minds on which positions to cover. So essentially they would try and make sure that the ball didn't go through the center, which meant the ball would come out wide a lot more frequently, and whoever stepped out, in this case it would be Alexander-Arnold, there was instantly a big issue for Kyle Walker in this position as the players had to shift over, and we saw a lot of really, really nice combinations on the flank between the players, with Mladenovic often ending up through on goal, or at least in a very good position to cross the ball into the box, which is where a lot of their opportunities came from, with a lot of really dangerous balls from this position here, which is where they had a good penalty shout as well in the second half. While England were a lot more exposed at the back, they were still able to defend relatively successfully, and the vast majority of the chances from Serbia did come from shots from outside the box, with Vlahovic having a good chance on the edge of the box, forcing a good save from Pickford in this position. But essentially, I think a structure like this will be difficult for England to deal with in the later stages of the competition, because if teams are able to stretch the defense as much as possible, we saw that they really struggled with these runs into the half spaces from any player in these positions here, and England were caught out. They defended the crosses well, but against a tougher opponent, this might not be the case later on in the competition. I think, and this is my personal opinion, I'm not telling Southgate or anyone how to do their job, I think England could get away with having slightly more aggressive players up top. So not relying on having all the players come towards the ball, because then you're just going to play it forward and you're just missing out all these players, but have more players confident, pushing forward and trying to attack in behind. We know Bellingham can make these late runs into the box. We've seen him do it countless times for Real Madrid, but you need other players around him to also move and disrupt the defensive shape. If you only have one player attacking a static line of 5, then the static line of 5 is just going to compensate for this, and you're never really going to create any danger for the opposition. So these are just my thoughts on how I think England struggled to create any major difficulties for Serbia's defense, but I'm curious to know what you thought of this performance. I saw a lot of comments towards Foden's performance maybe not being up to par, and maybe Harry Kane not being very present in the match as well. So I'm curious to know how you would change England to make them even more dangerous going forward in the later stages of the competition. That is, if they ever get there.